The first body was discovered just after dawn in a wooded strip near the Delaware River, positioned deliberately rather than discarded. The injuries were extensive and precise, far beyond what was necessary to kill. Detectives at the scene immediately understood this was not a robbery, not a fight that spiraled, and not an act of panic. Someone had taken time. Someone had planned the violence. Someone wanted the death to mean something to the people who carried it out. In the early 1970s, Camden, New Jersey was unraveling. Factories that had once anchored entire neighborhoods were closing one by one. Jobs disappeared, storefronts emptied, and abandoned houses spread block by block. Drugs flooded the city. Violent crime surged faster than police resources could keep up. Homicides blurred together, and in that chaos, patterns were easy to miss. It was in this environment that a small group of young men began meeting quietly in basements, vacant houses, and isolated outdoor spaces where no one would interrupt them. They did not organize around money or territory. They organized around belief. The group that would later be known as the Camden 28 spoke in absolutes. Loyalty was everything. Doubt was weakness. Outsiders were expendable. Leaders framed their worldview as purification, insisting that violence was necessary to cleanse betrayal and bind the group together. They presented themselves as protectors and judges, deciding who belonged and who did not. Recruits were brought in slowly, often young men desperate for belonging in a city that had already written them off. Initiation was gradual and calculated. New members were tested first with secrecy, then intimidation, then assault. Each step pushed them further across moral lines until retreat felt impossible. Shared guilt was the point. Once someone participated in violence, they were compromised. By the time murder was introduced, it was framed not as a crime, but as responsibility. Killing was presented as proof of loyalty. Participation ensured silence. Victims were chosen carefully. Some were former associates who questioned leadership or threatened exposure. Others were selected because they were vulnerable, transient, or unlikely to be reported missing immediately. Several were lured with promises of drugs, money, or protection. Once isolated, they were attacked by multiple members acting under direction. Survivors later described how participants were forced to take part so no one could claim innocence afterward. Refusal was not tolerated. The killings followed patterns police would only recognize later. Victims were restrained, beaten, and sometimes posed. Bodies were left in locations meant to be discovered but difficult to connect to one another. At first, detectives treated the deaths as unrelated homicides scattered across a city already drowning in violence. Witnesses were afraid. Rumors circulated about a crew or a family, but no one would name it openly. Fear kept mouths shut. Fear also kept the group intact. Members were told leaving was impossible. Anyone who talked would become the next example. Doubt was punished quickly and publicly. Violence became the glue holding the group together. As long as everyone shared guilt, everyone stayed silent. The cult sustained itself not through charisma or ideology alone, but through terror and enforced complicity. The case began to crack when one intended victim survived. After narrowly escaping a planned killing, a young man went to authorities and described what he had seen. He spoke about meetings held in abandoned buildings, about hierarchy and coded language, about leaders who ordered violence while keeping their own hands clean. He described how murders were planned, how participants were assigned roles, and how silence was enforced afterward. His account connected multiple unsolved murders detectives had failed to link. What once looked random suddenly formed a single pattern. Investigators moved cautiously. They understood that exposing the group too quickly could trigger retaliation or cause members to disappear. Surveillance was increased, informants were cultivated, statements were recorded and cross-checked. Detectives worked methodically, building cases piece by piece, When arrests finally came, they were sudden and coordinated, targeting leadership first. The city was stunned as men who had blended into daily life were revealed as participants in ritualized killings. Court proceedings were relentless. Jurors heard testimony describing initiation rituals that escalated from beatings to murder. Former members explained how fear replaced moral judgment and how refusal was met with threats of death. Some testified through visible terror, still afraid of retaliation even behind courtroom walls. Defense attorneys argued exaggeration and confusion, but physical evidence and corroborated accounts dismantled those claims. The violence had structure. The violence had intent. Convictions followed. Leaders received long prison sentences. Some lower-ranking members cooperated in exchange for reduced charges, haunted by what they had done and what they had witnessed. Families of victims sat through testimony describing final moments no one should ever have to hear. There was no justification that survived scrutiny, only control, belief, and blood. In the months after the arrests, investigators reopened cold cases across the city. Evidence rooms were revisited, old statements were reread, timelines were reconstructed. Some deaths could now be tied directly to the group through corroborated testimony or matching patterns of violence. Others remained unresolved, their circumstances suggestive but impossible to prove beyond doubt. For many families, answers came too late or not at all. Former members described how the group adapted as pressure increased. Meetings moved constantly. Locations changed without notice. Members were instructed to avoid being seen together in public and to deny knowing one another if questioned. The secrecy that once protected the cult eventually destroyed it, creating contradictions investigators learned to exploit. Each confession weakened the next person's resolve until silence collapsed entirely. For detectives, the case never truly ended. Missing persons reports in the early years had been delayed or dismissed. Some victims were written off as transients or runaways. That delay gave the group time to operate unchecked, reinforcing their belief that they were invisible and untouchable. The Camden 28s were dismantled, but the conditions that allowed them to exist did not vanish overnight. The victims were not symbols. They were not lessons. They were people whose lives were taken deliberately to satisfy belief and obedience. Their absence reshaped the city they left behind, even as their names faded from headlines. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.